Welcome, and thank you all for joining us for the Grantmakers in the Arts webinar, Addressing Accessibility in Arts Funding Programs, Events, and Materials. I'm Susan Chan, GIS Program Manager. Arts and accessibility is a civil rights issue, and arts philanthropy is in a privileged position to support practices and programs that promote full participation of all creative workers pursuing their work, including those with disabilities. GIA has had plenary and conference presenters at our annual conferences in the past discussing accessibility and artists with disabilities, but this is the first time we've had a webinar on this topic. It's a very big topic, not one that we can fully explore in 1 hour. Nonetheless, we hope that this session will provide you an overview and an introduction to ideas and practices to support you in your work with artists. We're pleased to have joining us Betty Siegel, Manager of Accessibility at the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, Risa Rifkind, Program Associate working with the Disabilities Fund and ADA 25 Advancing Leadership Program at Chicago Community Trust, which is a community foundation, and Ann Mulgrave, Manager of Grants and Accessibilities with Greater Pittsburgh Arts Council, a nonprofit regional arts agency. Together, they'll be discussing why accessibility is a social justice issue for arts philanthropy and how to identify and reduce barriers to access in funding programs, events, and materials, just like our title says. If you haven't already, I encourage you to read their bios on the webinar event page. And on that event page, you'll also find an ADA compliance guide for nonprofits, which was published by the Chicago Community Trust. Before we get started, a couple housekeeping notes. You should see a live captioning pod below the attendee list. Within that pod, you should find different controls to make individualized user adjustments as needed, such as the font size. At the bottom of your screen, you should also find a rectangular text box where you can type in your questions at any time during today's session. After we hear from the presentations, I will be back to facilitate the Q&A session with Betty, Risa, and Ann. So with that, we're going to get started with Betty Siegel with the Kennedy Center. Welcome, Betty.
Hi, how are you? Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to start off this conference by setting the framework of accessibility and inclusive practices. I'm going to address some trends and context. Mostly, I'm going to introduce some really big concepts about why we need to, as a community, address accessible and inclusive practices. And from my perspective, the reason why we do this work in inclusive and accessible practices is because it's a part of social justice. It's a part of our social commitment and our social contract with our constituents and our communities. So right off the bat, I'm going to introduce this idea that disability rights are a part of civil and human rights, and that's the really big picture that we all need to grab a hold of. Now, sometimes we struggle with this big picture, and the reason why is that oftentimes the disability rights movement asks us to look at disability in a new and unfamiliar way. And some of us find that to be a little bit threatening. So what I want to introduce to you is this idea that we're moving from looking at disability through the lens of an impairment or medical model to the lens of a civil or social rights model. Now, what does that mean? If you look at the screen, you'll see in front of you two graphics. On the left, on your left-hand side, is a really simplified representation of what we mean by a medical or impairment model, and on your right is a really simplified representation of what we mean by a rights or social model. The big differences between these models are in the very top bubble and the one immediately to the right, and that is that a medical or impairment model looks at there being something wrong with the individual. The disability resides in the human being versus the rights or social model where there is something, in a sense, wrong with society. So the challenge resides in society as a whole, not in an individual. And thus the big differences in these models is that in the medical model, we seek to change the individual to accommodate society versus the rights or social model where we seek to change society to accommodate the individual. Just as a quick example, let's think about my mom, who's 90 years old, and I going to a museum, and we arrive at the museum, and there's a grand stairway. Now, my mom, who can kick my butt in water aerobics, has troubles walking up and down steps. And so those steps are a huge barrier to her. I could say, well, Mom, that's too bad. You're just going to have to struggle up those steps. Or I could work with the museum or the venue to try to put into place other ways for my mom to get from the bottom of the steps to the entrance. And so in the medical model, the problem is with my mom's inability to walk up those steps. And in the social model, the problem is the steps themselves. The other thing that backs up these two different models is the way we look at the definitions of disability. So in the Americans with Disabilities Act, we see that the definition places the challenge on the individual, whereas in the definition for the World Health Organization, which they came out with in 2010, people are more or less disabled based on their interactions with that physical environment, the communication environment, information environments, social and policy environments. These are so much fun to talk about, but I only have 4 more minutes, so I'm going to kind of breeze past these concepts, but I thought it was important for us to think about these as we listen to our next 2 presenters. There are laws out there. These civil rights laws are really critical. I don't want any of us to forget about the 1973 Rehabilitation Act with Section 504, which basically prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in entities who receive federal financial assistance. Sometimes we forget about this particular law because the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act has been so all-encompassing. But I want to remind us not to forget about the Rehab Act, which is really the basis and beginnings of the disability rights movement and community getting their civil rights acknowledged. Don't forget about the 1975 Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Although it only applies to K-12 education, it is so important to remember that the right to a free and appropriate education is guaranteed under this law. In 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act, of course, you've got Title I, which addresses discrimination in employment, Title II, which addresses discrimination by state and local governments, and Title III, which addresses discrimination on the basis of disability in places of public accommodation. I could talk about these laws forever, but I'm not going to. But I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about them in the Q&A section of our time. Don't forget international law with the 2006 Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, which guarantees people the right to have access to culture. And also don't forget about your state and local laws, because sometimes those local laws provide more protections than our national and federal laws. Now, who are we doing this for? 56.7 million Americans with disabilities, almost 19% of the population. We have older adults. By 2030, there will be more people over the age of 60 than there are under the age of 30. Think about what that means to us as a community and our population. You also have younger adults. These are the people that were born on or around the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. They don't know a world in which there is not captioning on TV, where there is not a curb cut. Their expectations are elevated in regards to what we as a community are going to make sure they have access to. Finally, we have children and their families. 13% of school-aged children, K-12, have disabilities. The interesting thing when you look at this population is how different the type of disability looks in this population versus our senior population. If I go backwards, which I'm just going to do ever so briefly, to this slide, you'll see that a large percentage of the population of 64 years of people 64 and older is in the ambulatory category. That doesn't mean wheelchair. That just means people who, like my mom, might just have a little bit of difficulty going up and down steps, but it's a huge percentage of that population. Whereas when we look at children, we see the largest percentage of children with disabilities is in that specific learning disability category. The children with hearing loss or vision loss or mobility loss are all encompassed in that small little wedge up at the top left of 10% other disability. So keep this in mind as you're looking at the types of programming that you're doing. The disability populations change as we get older or as we get younger. I just want to say that we really need to remember to keep in mind a disability and accessibility friendly philosophy, and the key here is to always do things with your community, not for, to integrate access into the way in which you routinely do business. We can help our staff to do that by ensuring that we've leveraged and allocated appropriate resources, we've established policy, we're planning, and we're leading by example and action. I think that's critical. I'll wrap up, and I'm sorry to barrel through all this so quickly, but I want to leave time for our other presenters with this slide, which gives you some nice general resources that you can check with later, or that, my alarm is going off, or you're more than welcome to reach out to the Office of DSA and Accessibility and me at the information on the slide here. I think that about wraps up the context, and I'd like to pass this on to Risa.
Thanks, Betty, so much. I will try and use my best voice that you do so well on a webinar. So good afternoon, everyone, or good morning. My name is Risa, and I am a program manager at the Chicago Community Trust. And I focus on disability inclusion initiatives, including 2 projects, the Disability Fund, which I'll focus on, and ADA 25 Advancing Leadership, which I will touch briefly on. I started working here in 2015 during ADA 25 Chicago, which was Chicago's recognition of the 25th anniversary of the ADA, with the goal of creating legacy projects to further the spirit of the ADA for full participation and equal opportunity for people with disabilities. Next. So even in 2015, disability inclusion work was not new to the Trust. Actually, conversations around furthering inclusion and access of people with disabilities were happening in the early years of the Trust, which just celebrated its 100th anniversary. But recent history that I'll focus on includes the establishment of what is now known as the Disability Fund in 2004. This is one of the initiatives that I'll talk more about. A few years later, in 2010, for the 20th anniversary of the ADA, the Disability Fund published the white paper, Quest for Equality, which highlighted the biggest areas of opportunities or the largest gaps for people with disabilities in education, employment, community living, and those are still the focus for the Disability Fund now. In that year, in 2010, the Disability Fund also published the first iteration of the Renewing the Commitment Guide, which Susan mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, which is an ADA compliance guide for nonprofits. In 2015, as I mentioned, the Chicago Community Trust funded ADA 25 Chicago, which engaged over 200 partner organizations who committed to increasing inclusion. And it used the Quest for Equality as a background for its goals in education, in employment, and what we call community inclusion instead of community living, to expand it to arts and culture, for example, and we added technology. Some of those legacy projects include CBLN, which is our local chapter of USBLN, which is a business-to-business organization. It also included the creation and collaboration with the Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium, a cultural access calendar, which can be found on their website, which lists all the accessible performances that will be happening in Chicago. And then our last legacy project, or the last one I'll mention right now, is ADA 25 Advancing Leadership. I want to mention that all of this was in direct collaboration, as Betty highlighted, with leaders with disabilities in our community. All of these efforts were generated from ideas from the community and implemented with the community. In Chicago, we're really lucky to have such a vibrant disability-led community. And so next, I will talk about ADA 25 Advancing Leadership really quickly, but I would like to invite you to check out our website, ada25chicago.org, on our on the slide that you're looking at. And the vision of 8825 Advancing Leadership is that people with disabilities will lead with power and influence for full participation and equal opportunity. And really the goal is to get people with disabilities more civically engaged so that full participation and equal opportunity is a theme in our leadership in the region. And so I really do invite you to check out our website, but in the interest of time, I'm going to go next to our next slide, which highlights the Disabilities Fund. The Disabilities Fund's vision is that the Chicago region will be known as the most inclusive in the nation with widespread and deep commitments to the ADA's promise of equal opportunity, independent living, economic self-sufficiency, and full participation of people with disabilities. We do this through thought leadership, convening, and partnering with the trust to get these ideals out there into the community and into what we do internally. And so here's a couple of examples of that as we are developing a series of fact sheets that highlight the intersection of disability with another topic. And then we are also looking to advance education and employment right now in the healthcare sector. But more importantly for this webinar, the Disability Fund is the vehicle through which I do a lot of the internal work, and one of those things is I want to share with you now. Next. So following 2015, the Chicago Community Trust wanted to make sure it was doing everything it can to be accessible and inclusive. And to do this, to this end, starting in early 2016, I started in collaboration with Trust leadership and staff here to do a self-evaluation and internal looking assessment and plan for making sure that the Trust internal operation and then in exchange the external view of the Trust is as inclusive and as accessible as possible. We started this process looking at me partnering with a department and going department by department. This is an extremely long process, and right now I have worked with marketing and communications I started with last year, and HR and IT this year to look at the physical space, and IT to look at the digital and software space. But I want to tell you a little bit about what that collaboration looks like. So most importantly, this meant that each department took ownership of what was being done. So this required buy-in from the top and from the bottom, and meeting in the middle with the same goal. So the leadership of the department selects a liaison to work with me on this work so that it reinforces and solidifies that commitment within. That way it's a department work. We then, with my liaison, we then looked at the Renewing a Commitment Guide as a starting point to create an evaluation specific to the department. We also made sure to include voices, again, from the disability community here to accomplish this work and making sure that the evaluation is as inclusive as possible of all components of the department. And then we bring that back once we have, evaluated and gotten feedback about each component to community members to see their thoughts, to make sure any suggested changes is in alignment with what is really best practice for inclusion and access. So I want to, in my last remaining, I'm now over time, but in my remaining few moments, I wanted to share with you some items that marketing and communications has found and has done and how that has impacted the trust. Because that's really what's important. And all of these findings are shared at all staff meetings so that all staff is aware of what some of the changes are and so that some of those changes can be implemented as soon as possible. So for marketing and communications, we now have a new set of guidelines that include captioning at all large public events. In all of our invitations, we include language of how to request accommodations and who that point person is, name and email. Our social media is as accessible as we can make it, including writing image description for all posts, and using camel case in Twitter and hashtag. I invite you to actually check out a blog post that further highlights this. It's on the Trust website, as well as it's shared today from the Facebook of 8825 Advancing Leadership. And the last thing is that this process is a really evolving process over time. Over time, I fade out to continue to see that this is a department commitment and that it continues with or without me. And one example of how that will become apparent is that for registration pages, the Trust used to use Eventbrite. However, it's not accessible, but it's no longer accessible based on a recent update. So the platform was evaluated last year when we did the evaluation, but then after I'm starting to step away, we found this out, and so the Trust is now using Google Forms until a better platform can be suggested. So some tips to get started today, because this is a lot of information, is really, if you're interested and you want to do this, and I know you're committed because you're on this webinar, is to connect with your disability community, connect with your local technical assistant, and I encourage you to download the compliance guide that is available on the link on the slide. Next, I just want to highlight that this is a very hot topic currently in philanthropy based on these 3 linked blog posts, and I invite you to check that out. And next, I invite you to connect with me via email or a phone number with any questions, and I know that was a lot really quickly, so if there are follow-up items I can help with, please let me know. Thank you, and now I'll turn it over to Anne.
Hello, everyone. My name is Anne Mulgrave, and I am the Manager of Grants and Accessibility at the Greater Pittsburgh Arts Council. As you can tell from my title, I wear 2 hats. I manage several funding programs here at GPAC, and when we only do arts funding. In addition, I lead our Increasing Access to Pittsburgh Arts and Culture initiative, which began in January of 2011. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that, because what I have learned wearing these 2 hats is that as a grant maker, if you want to add a goal of increasing social inclusion or increasing access to the arts, to do it by simply requiring people to comply with something without giving them the skills to comply is ineffective. So what we have done at GPAC is we have created a program that in which we educate arts managers, facilitate a network of access peers, provide one-on-one technical support to arts organizations. We provide a curated list of arts-specific resources for arts organizations. We work hard to increase regional capacity for accessibility by providing shared equipment, and we build bridges with the disability community. We have received funding for this project. Part of my job is been funded by both the NEA and by a local disability funder, so that's one thing that funders can do to support this. Briefly, in the past 7 years, we have held over 55 workshops with over close to 1,600 participants from 90 regional arts organizations. Now, what we have learned from this work that is going to be very important to grant makers who want to work with arts organizations to become more accessible is that what you must focus on is equity, not compliance. The concept of accessibility as a civil rights resonates more with arts agencies than the idea of complying with the ADA, which seems overwhelming when you first approach it. Secondly, and this is something that I learned from Betty years and years ago, is that accessibility really is nothing more than good customer service, and arts organizations are very good at customer service. They meet people where they are and help them participate. And secondly, this is mission-driven. The issue with accessibility for most arts managers is that they do not see the barriers, because the barriers are more than physical barriers. They are programmatic barriers. And they don't see them. And when they do see them, they go, whoops, I didn't know, because their mission, as Betty has told me in the past, our mission is to provide our art to everybody but you. That's not their mission. So they work hard to break down the barriers to make their work accessible. Secondly, arts managers DIY. They will not hire a consultant to fix their website. They do it themselves. So the most important support they receive are specific practical DIY skills. Secondly, peer-to-peer learning is crucial. If one museum knows how to make accessible signage and the other person in the other museum can call them, not only does it help them learn faster and accelerate the pace of change, but it also helps standardize the patron experience. And the last thing is, arts organizations develop momentum to becoming more accessible and welcoming to people with disabilities, and then they will hit a point where they get stuck. And they have questions that they cannot answer. So, for example, my role is when they get stuck to be the person who they can send the really embarrassing, stupid email to, and I can respond with the very simple response, and they keep going. Next, and this is crucial for funders, I feel. If you build it, they may not come. People with disabilities and their experiences at arts organizations have led them to feel like problems before they are patrons. And arts organizations have to work hard to send the message that they welcome people with disabilities, to develop those relationships and build trust. So, what can a grant maker do? You have to, when you are reviewing proposals for art, it is important to understand that accessibility is just a normal cost of doing business, not a special program. You want to expect or require an accessibility line item in every budget. Arts organizations do not include these because they think that you are going to give them $20,000 regardless of whether they include that. And they don't want to take that money away from their work. So as a radical idea, I've always thought the way you would encourage more people to provide a programmatic accommodations in the forms of captioning, American Sign Language interpretation, purchasing assistive listening devices, providing audio description for people with visual impairments, is to bump up their grants a little if they show a commitment to accessibility. And also, of course, you want to be able to include an access metric in your final reports. So, some thoughts on physical accessibility. One of the things that we've learned is most arts organizations do not own their spaces. These organizations focus on programmatic accessibility. And when I talk about programmatic accessibility, it's providing assistive listening devices to people with hearing loss. It's providing audio description of the visual content of the art to people who are blind. It's providing captioning, like at the opera, the super captioning, but everywhere. So that's the expense that many arts organizations have. Those that do own their own spaces, the cost of physical improvements can be prohibitive and is often excluded from funding programs, so there is a great need to increase physical accessibility and for the purchase of equipment. So, questions to consider when you're looking at your grant process in terms of accessible grant making. Is your online application accessible to all applicants? People who are blind access the internet, have electronic access through something called a screen reader. And oftentimes, as the way the screen reader looks at a website and then reads it out loud can make it very hard to actually understand what the website is saying if the code is not written properly. So what I suggest people do is check your website and application process with this particular tool. What this is this Wave WebAIM tool is you just type in the URL for your website or your online grant program application, and it will go through it, and all of a sudden these little bubbles will pop up, not telling you not just explaining what the accessibility problem is, but telling you how to fix it. The next thing is, is your online application accessible to all panelists? Our grant panel includes all our grant panels include people with disabilities. We have panelists who are blind, we have panelists with significant hearing loss, we have panelists who are deaf. They often have issues reading things like the PDF that your online application might spit out. Most PDFs are just images. When you spit out a form from an online grant process, you will, and then you run it through the Adobe Accessibility Checker, all these little colored bubbles are problems. So oftentimes, the PDFs you spit out aren't readable by screen readers. Another major issue with online grant processes is if someone cannot use a mouse, if someone has limited manual dexterity, and they have to tab through a website, they cannot upload work samples because they can't use a mouse. So, getting to work samples, are your work samples accessible? Videos must be captioned. YouTube has some decent tools. Don't use their speech recognition because it will come out very bad. But if you have a transcript, they have a good tool that can sync the uploaded transcript to the speech. Vimeo, the last time I checked, does not have those. If you have an image, it should contain a descriptive alt text, and documents are best read by screen readers in Word or plain text. So as a grant maker, you also have to build trust, and you also have to model this. This is the accessibility information that we put on the bottom of every event that we do. This is not you will notice the language is welcoming. GPAC is committed to making its programs accessible to everyone. If an accommodation such as ASL, open captioning, blah, 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 would help you fully participate in our programs, please contact so-and-so 2 weeks before the event. But listen to this. We realize that both events and your schedule often come together at the last minute. If an accommodation would be helpful and the lead time is less than 2 weeks, please call us. Most people with disability, that sends a big message to people because what it says is, yeah, we know this is hard and we're not giving you a different standard than everyone else. You can call us less than 2 weeks and we'll work with you, but we're not making any promises. The other thing that people with disabilities will check for on your website and in your materials is if you include ability in your diversity and equity statements. That is a sign. They will also look for images that include people with disabilities. They will look at all those things as tells as to whether or not you are truly welcoming them. Right. And now here is the big one. When you are reviewing your applications, do you apply a disability justice lens? Are you aware of the implicit bias of ableism? So to demonstrate that, I want to show you these pictures. So this is what I call Disney versus Game of Thrones. In the lower left-hand corner is an image of Captain Hook, clearly the villain, leering out at people, twisting his mustache around his hook. This creates that old trope of an image of people with disabilities as being bad, evil, or wrong. But then you look at Jaime Lannister up here in the right-hand corner. This is after Jaime lost his hand, and he's wearing his gold hand, and he is protecting himself by taking that gold hand and stopping a sword. And what that is an implicit image that disabilities aren't bad. They can be good. They can be beneficial, and if any of you are Game of Thrones fans like me, you've noticed that Jaime kind of has become a better person since he lost his hand, but not perfect. So I'm saying when you start looking at the work and the art that you are funding, start thinking about whether or not you are funding theater productions in which a role of a person with a disability is not being played by someone with a disability. Are you thinking that all work by visual artists with disabilities is actually art therapy and not high-quality art? These are all implicit biases that some of us have, many of us have, and we may not be aware of them, so please think about it. And now I am done.
Great, thank you so much to Anne and Risa and Betty. Those were fantastic presentations, and I said that in the beginning that we couldn't cover a lot in an hour, but that was in 30 minutes we covered so much material. Thank you so much. I am now going to start the Q&A portion of this today's session, but before we start, I just want to remind you that you can type your questions in the rectangular box at the bottom of your screen. We're also going to switch over the control of the slides to you so that you can feel free to move through them and reference any of the slides as you construct your questions. So with that, I'm going to start with And since we already have you, is there any risk to funders if their grantees are not accessible?
So here's the way it works. There's kind of trickle-down liability and risk here. Not risk so much as, so let's say you are a local government funder, or you're like me. The NEA gives money to your state arts agency. The state arts agency then gives it to local arts agencies to re-grant within their communities. The obligations of the NEA as a government organization and as a funder trickle down to your grantees. And it's your job when you're looking at the applications to see if they are complying with the ADA. Now, what does it mean to comply with the ADA? For most nonprofit arts organizations, that means that you have done an accessibility audit and have made a plan to address the issues. It doesn't mean that you go bankrupt. So yes, there is a risk in terms of any federal or state money that you distribute comes with those obligations to your grantees, and it's your job to assure that they are accessible.
Betty?
Yeah, can I jump in? Can I jump in to do a little clarification on that? Because Ann did such a great job. But the obligation to ensure that your grantees are following federal disability rights law is under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. That's where we get this obligation to not discriminate if you receive federal financial assistance. So the trickle down that Ann's talking about is coming from that regulation and law. The ADA enforcement there comes strictly from the U.S. Department of Justice or from an individual against whom discrimination has occurred.
Yes, and so your risk may be that you get, I'm not going to say that, but it would be hard. Well, I'm not going to assess the risk, but it is possible that if your work and your programs aren't accessible, that you could be sued.
Yeah. Risa, do you have anything to add?
No, I will let Ann and Betty answer that one. Thank you.
Okay. Actually, Risa, while I have you, I would, could you tell us a little bit more about, I think it's really fascinating what the Chicago Community Trust has done organization-wide in really bringing the call for justice and actions organization-wide. And would you have any suggestions for an organization? You know, we have a lot of, let's say, program officers who are on the webinar who need to do a little work, perhaps, to convince leadership that this is something that the organization should approach. Do you have any tips for that?
Sure, yeah, great question. I think that what Betty and Ann each touched on as well are good points for making a persuasive argument or case, if you will, including the demographic information that people with disabilities are already in programs that are funded and cashed by grants that might be happening, that people with disabilities are our neighbors, our friends, our family, you know, they are our grantees, and looking at it from a customer service angle is also really great. You know, it's bettering the community by being more inclusive. I also think that connecting wherever you are with local leaders and local leaders in the disability community and the disability community wherever you are is also a great way. Because, you know, even though there are overarching themes, each community is a little bit different, and it would be good to have a sense of what your local community would like to see foundations and philanthropy be involved with to get to that point of having leadership buy-in. I also, on my PowerPoint, shared 3 recently-ish posted articles and blog posts that talk about the role of philanthropy in moving forward disability inclusion, and I would recommend reading and sharing those articles as well. And, I think what Betty said about disability rights being civil rights and that it's connect, that's totally true.
Thank you. And can you share a little bit more also about your organization's commitment and how that commitment kind of got distributed throughout the organization?
A lot of nagging, basically. I mean, essentially what we, you have to begin with policy. You have to begin by creating a policy. And one of GPAC's values is accessibility. So and we are also committed to modeling what arts organizations can do. We're not very big. We don't have a large staff. We aren't a presenting organization, so we don't put on art, but we do a lot of workshops. And at all of them, people see these accommodations, and they just come to expect them. Our hardest issue really is selecting accessible venues because, you want to go to venues that artists love, and they have a tendency to be old, and they have a tendency to be maybe down at heel. And so one of the things that works very well in our organization is the 3 Bs. Bottom floor, bathroom, and bus line. When you select a space, make sure that it's on a bottom floor, means that there aren't steps to get in, that it has an accessible bathroom, and that it is on a bus line for people who need to use those. And that's actually helpful for everybody. So sometimes it's as simple as coming up with little rules like that and having a value and policy that backs them up.
Betty, how do we better engage people with disabilities in the grant-making process?
Well, I think there's amazing things that we can all do. One is to think about if the form of grant making that you're doing involves an adjudication panel to ensure that there's people with disabilities sitting in on and adjudicating. We all bring a different lens to the way we see the world, and in the same way that you look at other representation of other populations in your process, you need to look at disability as a distinct type of community that needs to have representation in the process as well. I think Risa's quite right that you reach out to your local disability community to identify those adjudicators, or you can look at a national level for some of the global thinkers in this community. They definitely exist, and some of them are on this phone right now.
Great. And I'm going to keep you on just for a second. So we have a question about, as a grant maker whose grants may not be used for capital improvements, I know that you provided a list of other resources, and I don't know if in that list there also was a list of other national or regional grant makers whose funds can be used for capital projects towards accessibility, or if you know of other resources that you can share now.
That's a great question, and it's the one that I hate the most because I don't have a really good answer for you. A lot of donors and funders restrict the use of their dollars, and they're really focused on programmatic access. So what we really need to do is to remember that accessibility, the kind of things that we need to do capital improvements, should be a line item in our budget in the same way that we budget for toilet paper. You have to remember that access and making sure that things are physically accessible are just a part of the way that you're moving forward to address your built environment. That's not a satisfactory answer, and I might ask Anne and Risa if you are aware of any source for capital improvement dollars out there.
If I can step in, this is Anne. We have a local funder that distributes 1% of our sales tax in our county, the Allegheny Regional Asset District. And they recently opened up one of their funds to include capital improvements. They have a capital, and also accessibility capital improvements. And I think that this is the sort of work that has to come from funders of that size that are also local. They give away approximately $90 million a year. 10 of it is to the arts, sometimes more than that. And funders of that size, public funders, or other organizations, you have to think about making it a priority for people, because all arts organizations will need some sort of capital support, but this is really a matter of gatekeeping. And if there's a physical gate, we should fund the removal of it.
Risa, did you have anything to add?
No, I think, Anne's example, I think there are other local kind of opportunities, but it varies by region.
Great. I'm going to keep you on for just a second. We do have a question about the crossover intersectionality between racial equity and disability rights work, and there absolutely, I think it doesn't take an academic to know that there is intersectionality between racial equity and disability rights. And we see that in terms of access to health care and access to educational resources. But in your work, Risa, how is the Community Trust addressing intersectionality issues, and how would we might encourage, as we do our racial equity work and other types of equity work as funders, folding in and integrating the work of disability rights?
Yeah, so another great question. As you, Susan, or maybe the person who asked the question really highlighted, there is such intersectionality and overlap. It wouldn't be advantageous to not recognize that. And so the Disability Fund here at the Chicago Community Trust is trying to address some of those intersectional items through the creation of the fact sheet series that I mentioned. We are in the design process right now, if you will, with the first one coming out. It was just finalized, and it will be available on the website shortly, and then a second one coming out soon. But to go backwards, the first one is looking at the intersection of youth and disability, and within that there is the intersection of race as well. It was a really small screenshot that I included on the slide, but if you are able to see, it highlights that the intersection of the opportunity youth, and so opportunity youth are young men who are out of work and out of school between the ages of 16 and 24, I believe, and so that overlap with the number of 13,000 of the 41,000 of those youth having a disability. So we are trying to continue the intersectional look at where those different identities come into play, and it's a continued conversation here because the trust is really committed to racial equity and making sure that disability is continued in that conversation, and what the Disability Fund is trying to do by creating and disseminating these fact sheets to key partners, including colleagues in the space as well. So I didn't really totally answer the question, as I mentioned, my work is really going department to department, and so far I have only worked with marketing, communication, HR, and IT. So program has not yet done this, and it's just a random kind of order. There's no rhyme or reason for why that. So I hope that's clarity.
Yeah, great, thank you. And I'm going to direct the next question to you. How do you handle questions about the quality of artistic expression when prioritizing the inclusion of artists with disabilities in the programs you run?
Well, so I will say that I do not see a conflict there. And I would say that this is kind of part of our implicit bias. I think one of the things that holds back visual artists or performing artists is that, for performing artists, their bodies are not what we expect to see on the stage. And for visual artists, sometimes we assume that we dismiss their work as being more art therapy than high quality art. What I would suggest that people do is just look at the work. about a year ago when Betty's Leadership Exchange in Arts and Disability Conference was in Pittsburgh, we sent out a call nationally for a visual art show for artists with disabilities. And every single piece of work we got, you wouldn't know it was by an artist with a disability. They weren't about disability. They were just good art. So what I would suggest that you do is you remove the barriers to your process and see what comes in. And I think you'll be surprised at how good it really is.
Thank you, Anne. Betty, do you have anything to add on that?
I think that Anne really stated it really well. I think that we do have these biases that we view the world through, and it's really important to set that aside and just look at the quality of the work, because there are artists out there whose work is amazing, and they have disabilities, and that's just a part of who they are as human beings. And if we embrace that, then we're gonna get to where we want to be artistically.
Can you recommend an online grant application program that's set up to be accessible to all?
So can I jump in here for a second? So I struggle with this. Yeah, so I struggle with this, and so this is my solution. I ask people to complete a Word document application and email it to me, and my work samples are a link. I don't want a file. I don't want you to upload anything. I just want a link. And then literally, that's what I do. Their Google Forms is actually extraordinarily good. We began a new grant program. There's a way to maximize Google Forms for you to be able to use. And the nice thing about Google Forms is that it is cloud-based, so it's not all going to a server. So when 20 minutes before your grant deadline, everybody is on there submitting an application, it doesn't crash. But it's also something where you can't save your work. It is one of the first applications we got in our new grant program by maximizing the accessibility on Google Forms was from a visual artist who is blind. And when I called her and asked her why she hadn't applied before, she said she was unable to do it on some of the other programs, but this was easy as pie. So Google Forms is a good one. I would suggest that if you are paying someone to manage your online grant program, what you need to do is call them and ask. Look at what they have to say. Slidering used to be great, but as a local art service agency that's a nonprofit, we can't afford things like that. And frankly, it's easier for me to just use a Word document and have them email it to me.
And, you know, I'm going to bore into that a little bit. With a Word document, so I guess what I'm hearing, though, is that the burden of organizing that information really then falls on you, because it's not like, what do you call it, like collated for you, or it.
Yes, I do a lot of photocopying, but and I've started to measure my grant panel books in terms of weight instead of pages. But it is. The panelists actually like it, and the barriers are low, so it is a decision that we've made to do that. And I have been doing this in our grant programs for 5 years now, and I've not had any problems aside from paper cuts.
Right. And I think this is a situation where we have to ask ourselves if we're committed to the social justice value, is how, you know, is if what are we willing to take on, what kind of burdens are we willing to take on in order to remove the burdens on other people. So
and Sujan, just to add on to that, don't forget the U.S. Department of Justice has always held that websites and so online application forms like this, they've always held that these do fall under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so Anne had been talking about risks before. We have an obligation to look at what we're doing online and ensure that it's as accessible to people with disabilities as it is to anyone else. looking at WC3 for their recommendations on how to make a website and online applications accessible would be a good place to start. And then to make sure that when you are entering into a contract to use a particular web-based application, that you ask the vendor to please provide you with a statement or documentation that their product is accessible to people with disabilities.
Thanks. I'm just going to ask one last question before we wrap up, and I think this is directed back to Anne because it came out in your presentation, but if Risa or Betty have anything to add, that'd be great. The question is, can you speak to the metrics that you include in your final reports? What does that look like, and how do you ask the questions?
In general, my response when we are dealing with final reports, I ask people to look at their application and tell me what really happened. And so for me, it begins at the beginning. When we're assessing applications about accessibility, and let's say it is a musical program in a nursing home, one of the questions that we will ask before I submit the application to the panel is, do you have assistive listening? Do you have these things? And then they will answer the question, yes or no. And then you will look at, when the final report comes in, whether or not they've done that. And in general, my panels have difficulty scoring applications like that high because they are working with a population that has documented issues with mobility and hearing loss, and they're not actually making the work accessible to them. So how effective is that grant? Another thing that I should caution you all about is that metrics about accessibility are very difficult to gather. For example, Betty's the expert on online ticketing, but let's say, for example, you want to measure how many people with disabilities use wheelchair seats. Well, you can see how many wheelchair seats you sell, but you don't know if they're being used by people with disabilities or somebody who just wants more legroom. You know, there are lots of different ways. We have struggled with this for years about it because, for example, if you have captioning, you really don't know who's using it in your theater. What we've done is but you can count the number of people who use an assistive listening device. You can count the number of people who take advantage of audio description because they're going to need some equipment to do that. You can take it, you know how many people have participated in a tour for people with the museum tour for people with dementia and their caregivers. The question is, are people keeping track of those numbers, and are you asking to see them? General questions like, are your performances held in accessible venues? You cannot answer that yes, because those definitions are too big and too broad. I would suggest you look for metrics about patron engagement more than actual venues. And ask questions like, do you include all of your contact information for programmatic accessibility or questions about accessibility on all of your marketing materials?
Betty, Risa?
I just want, sorry, Betty, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, this is how you ask the question is carefully and with a great deal of thought behind it. But this is the type of demographic, you can ask demographic information. You just want, because we ask that all the time. Look to, there's a guide for writing and reporting about people with disabilities that will certainly be a first place to stop to look for any type of appropriate language. So that's a good resource that you can use when you're crafting these general demographic questions.
And Risa?
I was just going to jump in and say that I know we're ending, but one thing I forgot to say is that compliance is as the guide, the renewing the commitment guide that I showed is a good thing to start with. We always try to go beyond compliance and go, and the example of captions is a great one, but measuring impact is difficult. But we tend to get a lot of submitted emails or in-person stories about how they were a good combination someone never thought of, but they really appreciated it. So documenting that is also a good way to try and go about collecting some kind of testimonial.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to our great presenters, Risa, Betty, Ann, for sharing what you do at your organizations. And we've got so many great tips and resources for us to take back to our own organizations and look at our own practices. So thank you. We will be sending out the links to today's recorded presentation and a PDF copy of the slide deck. So there were a few slides that had a lot of links and resources and emails in there. You will be getting a PDF copy of that. And also in that email, you get a brief feedback survey. And all of this will happen within the next day. We really hope that you'll take a few moments to give us your feedback on today's session. And as we look into future programming on the topic or other topics of interest to you. So thank you again for joining us. Have a great rest of your afternoon. And have a great day. Thanks.